Welcome into the latest episode of the 5 Reasons Podcast. I'm here, as always, again with Chris Whittingham, who's back from his trip across the pond. We'll get into that here a little bit on the podcast. Now that you have found us, make sure that you hit the subscribe or follow button on your favorite podcast provider. One reason that you want to do that is if you had done that, you would have found a new podcast that's actually going to be appearing on our feed every month, once a month. Jason Jackson, who you know very well as the Heat host, you find him on the sidelines during Heat games for Fox Sports Sun, and Windy Dees, who I believe actually, Chris...
That's Dr. Windy Dees.
Dr. Windy Dees was a professor of yours at the University of Miami. Is that correct?
Yes, indeed. Part of my double major broadcast journalism sports administration at the University of Miami. Yeah, I might have had 2 classes with her, but I definitely had 1.
Well, she didn't hold it against us, and she decided to join the network along with Jax. They're doing a monthly podcast called Minding Our Business, hashtag MOB for Mob, which is going to be about sports business and sports sponsorships. And the first episode just posted on our feed on this Monday morning, and it is as good as you'd expect. Jason Jackson absolutely knows what he's doing. They got into the national championship game, a lot of the media stuff related to that, sponsorships, etc. And it's interesting because this is a topic that can be dry for some, but not when Jax and Windy are doing it. So it's going to be a totally different approach to this than what you may anticipate, and that's going to appear on our feed. So
really found some of the things they were talking about from a sponsorship point of view interesting, because they were talking about the jersey patches that are on NBA teams, and frankly, how they're actually undervalued, that teams are actually charging too little for what in the end has been the brand exposure of Goodyear on the chest of LeBron James as he's motioning towards J.R. Smith. What are you doing? That there's a Goodyear ad on his chest as that's happening, that in the end that contract for Goodyear was undervalued. So I found that bit really interesting, and they cover a lot of good sports business topics.
Do you notice it? I see. That's always my question about those kind of things. Like, I don't know if I realized what was on LeBron James' jersey, but I guess you do subliminally, right?
Right, exactly. Advertising is not about active sort of awareness. It's about subliminal awareness, and that, Goodyear, it has, and their logo has been on everything finals related for a couple of years now. And while no longer is that important to Goodyear, maybe they can find another team to sponsor. But at the very least, while the Cavs were going to the finals, that was a very lucrative sponsorship for Goodyear. So I found that fascinating.
All right, so check out that podcast. Also, check out the other 14 feeds in our network. You can find them all by typing in 5 Reasons Sports into your favorite podcast provider. Obviously, 3 Yards Per Carry is one you're going to want to follow. They did something similar to what we're going to do today, although we're a few days further down the road now, where they evaluated all of the Dolphins coaching candidates. So make sure that you check that out, because I was a little surprised by the direction that a couple of those guys went there. Also, check out Miami Heat Beat. We have a watch party coming up. You're going to hear about that here on this episode. We've got one coming up for Heat Bucks. The Heat are back now at 500. So we've got Heat Bucks. We are not 500. We're 0-8 in watch parties. So definitely join us on January 15th. If you're hoping for the Heat to still tank, because that's probably what's going to happen in that game. That's going to be at Duffy's in North Miami Beach. And also check out the new podcast in our network, Chamber Podcast on Fitness, hosted by Chris Chambers, and also Out for the Count, hosted by Vic Bermudez and Armando Alvarez. All right, so now that Chris is back, you missed a lot. Let's just say that. You missed a lot. Those that happen to be the 2 busiest sports weeks of the year down here. Not that I was anticipating that.
I mean,
but
think about how improbable it was, particularly. So let's just sort of draw the dividing line at the Miami Miracle, right? Just sort of from there that the Dolphins season would deteriorate to such a point that they were by the end it kind of felt inevitable that they were firing Adam Gase. And then from a Hurricanes point of view, who could have possibly seen coming that Mark Richt would just one day wake up and decide to retire? Like, you knew that Blake James was probably going to play a heavy hand against Richt and asking him to fire people and asking him to make sweeping changes in the Hurricanes program, but for Rick to decide to quit basically was shocking to me. And so, I thought I had planned out a vacation pretty well when, the hurricane season would die down and the Dolphin season would die down, and good Lord, to the contrary. And I kind of felt bad as I was, sitting at Old Trafford, which is Manchester United Stadium, and, we get a Bleacher Report notification, hey, Mark Richt is just retired. Like, what? Well, what is happening? What am I missing back in the United States? But yeah, that's just how it was. That it was shocking to from every possible perspective that those 2 situations deteriorated so quickly.
Well, and here's one thing we won't ever do again. We won't rank the top stories of a year in early December, because we did that. We did that with Chris Fisher, and ours would have looked a whole lot different at that. But that was right after the Miami Miracle. But certainly, we would have updated the Richt one with Manny Diaz, and then the Gase firing. I can say that let's, before we move on to the new head coach, and as we're talking here, there's some news on the Dolphins head coaching situation, so we'll get to that. But can we just say that I was the first person in the media to sort of
to
start
stake out
calling
the anti-Adam Gase corner?
Right. Like everybody's on that corner now all of a sudden. I do remember some of the brushback that I was getting about 8 weeks ago when I started comparing him to Joe Philbin, and apparently Steve Ross ended up agreeing. And it was actually Craig Mish in our network who I thought had the most interesting information that was put out during this whole thing. I love how Craig gets news on other beats. So he's the host of our Swings and Mishes podcast, our Marlins podcast. He's still working. Real Muto hasn't been traded yet. So Craig is still pounding the pavement on that one. That might be a couple of years. But he did tweet out about the confrontation that Gase had with Ross after the Indianapolis game. And now if you sort of look back, you can say, okay, maybe that's where this lack of communication started, because Gase was asked after the loss in Buffalo. I was listening to the press conference in my car, and he was asked about, did he talk to Steve Ross after the game? And he says, we had a short conversation. They're all short. And he just moved on. And it struck me as odd that he wouldn't praise the owner there or something, right? If you're trying to keep your job. And it turns out that this went back a few weeks, actually, where he and Ross had a falling out. And there's been more information on this. So anyway, I did stake out the anti-Gase corner. Apparently, the Packers, Browns, and other Jets and other teams around the NFL are not on that same corner yet. And
his reputation is still strong. Somehow, after doing absolutely nothing for he took the Dolphins to the playoffs. That's always what I held on to. That Dolphins team shouldn't have made the playoffs. And frankly, for any Dolphins coach to take the Dolphins to the playoffs is unlikely, considering they're playing with one arm tied behind their back in the Patriots division. But I still, over the last 2 years, you didn't see a ton of positive from Adam Gase. You didn't see the quarterback whisper magic working on Ryan Tannehill, and you wonder how he's maintaining his reputation in the league too after being fired, generally, particularly for Dolphins coaches. Can you think of a Dolphins coach that has rebounded after getting fired and taken another NFL job? I don't think that's ever happened.
Not a full-time job. Both Sperano and Philbin ended up getting
interim jobs.
Interim jobs. They were coaches on a staff.
Nick Saban's doing okay for himself, but I'm saying at NFL level.
No, Dave never did. Cam never did. Cam got the offensive coordinator job in Baltimore, but he never got another head coaching job in the NFL. Even Jim Bates, who was briefly here, never got another opportunity. Now, Bowles was interim here and ended up getting a head coaching job. But yeah, none of the guys who were full-time head coaches. I know Dan Campbell, who was also interim here, has gotten a few looks. Although I heard he was not interested in the Dolphin job, which is interesting. It does seem. And this is sort of a larger issue. And before we get to the coaches, I want to get to the organization as a whole with you. It doesn't seem like people who've worked for the Dolphins really want to come back either. Like Dan Campbell is not interested in the head coaching job here. We've seen a lot of coordinators who don't want to come back here. I'll be curious to see if Scott Linehan, becomes a candidate here for offensive coordinator.
They struggled in the past too to get GM candidates in. I remember. I think when they settled on Dennis Hickey,
he was 7.
Right? Yeah, they were going for the big names, and none of them even wanted to come interview.
Yeah, it's odd, right? You do, the same things that apply to players apply to coaches and executives, which is no state tax. The weather is the same for coaches and executives as it is for players. Maybe the nightlife is not quite as important to you, but a lot of the things that are beneficial about South Florida are still there. Yet nobody wants to come, to work for this owner, even though this owner spends money. It's odd. It speaks to the incompetence, I think, or the perception of incompetence. And again, the Gase thing speaks to the perception of competence with him, which I think has been mostly a national media-driven narrative. He has been very good, or his agent has been very good, at greasing national NFL guys. That's the only thing I can think of, because there were some tweets that came out after his firing about what a great head coach that other teams were going to get from prominent NFL reporters. And I'm like, did you watch this team? Like, I know the Dolphins,
Right.
like that's our punishment in life, like that we have to watch them on a weekly basis. And most, when they're going out to 8% of the country, right? Like, typically your national NFL guys are not going to be here for the games. They're not going to watch the games. They're not going to catch up with them. But like, if they watched any of it, like, did they understand how Adam Gase lost the locker room?
And particularly on the primetime games when everyone would be watching, they got hammered like way more often
Every
than not.
time.
When they played on Thursday night, every time they got smoked.
Right. So I don't know what it is that they're watching. Like I said, unless he's greasing them. I think that happened with a couple of the local guys too, honestly. They just liked Gase and they gave him the benefit of the doubt until the very, very, very end. And you missed the last presser, which basically he blamed, he named every player who was injured in the last 2 weeks. And CK and I came to the same, conclusion that he basically wanted to get fired, and he knew that there were other jobs that were going to be out there.
Or he was establishing the narrative so that when he interviewed with other teams, these are the things that he would say to justify the fact that his team just went 7-9 and floundered down the stretch when they had a chance to make the postseason.
But I never understood why he had to do that, because couldn't his agent or he do that behind the scenes? Like that's the odd one to me. Like I don't understand, unless he was trying to lose the locker room and trying to sort of embarrass Ross and embarrass Tannenbaum and others, why he had to go public with that stuff. You could make that same case if you wanted to keep your job to Steve Ross. You could make that same case to other teams' executives or owners, that you made publicly. Instead, you look like an ass. And there really is no way around it. Like Adam Gase over the last few weeks sounded like an ass. Like he just not like he had sounded earlier. Like I had some issues with his accountability over the first 2.5 seasons, but nothing like the last 6, 7, 8 weeks. Like he just, everything was somebody else's fault, and he's gone. So let's move on now. Let's go to what they did, Chris. I just want your sort of quick, take on this. Moving Mike Tannenbaum out, putting Chris Greer in charge of the entire operation. Did you like it? Did you have an issue with it?
I understood Simon's point on 3 yards per carry, which is if you're going to blow the thing up, blow the thing up. One of the things that's interesting to me, because he then mentioned it along the same lines with the Rizzi candidacy for the head coaching job, was that, hang on a second, this Dolphins organization has been plagued by losing culture. It doesn't feel like anyone who's in it actually knows how to win, right? And that I feel like is one of the biggest issues, is that Stephen Ross has not surrounded himself with people that know how to win. And again, they've tried and they failed. And the idea that you would then promote the two guys that have had sort of the best longevity within the organization, Greer and Rizzi, who have been here for more than a decade, to try and fix that problem when no one around there knows how to win. Why would you then pluck two guys from internally, one of whom, obviously has worked his way up the ladder, or both of whom have worked their way up the ladder, and try and go about it that way? So I kind of understood it, but to me the thing that I found most interesting is Stephen Ross saying at the press conference, well, I put it to Adam Gase that we want to rebuild, and he wasn't in for it. And so Stephen Ross is declaring a path here. He is declaring what, for me, now he said we don't want any 3-13s along the way, but if they go 3-13 next year, they might get Tua Tagovailoa, and that will have been worth going 3-13, maybe even 2-14 next year to get that quarterback that could potentially change your franchise. That's the one thing that they haven't had. It's the most obvious thing in the world, and I really do think Stephen Ross, between the leaked reports that he wanted to go after Lamar Jackson, and then Lamar Jackson takes the Ravens to the playoffs, and between these comments, right, that he is saying we want to rebuild, I almost think that these two people might not be in it for the long haul. I think, if Darren Rizzi ends up getting the job, and Chris Greer has the GM job, maybe you're using them as your 1 year buffer to lose a lot. The fan base won't expect much anyway. The fan base might even get on board with the idea of them losing games. You trade all your best players. You trade Xavier Howard before you have to extend him. You trade Rashad Jones to whoever wants to take on his money. You trade everyone that you think can help you win games next year. Have a terrible year and try and get Tua Tagovailoa in the draft. That appears to be the path of least resistance to the Dolphins heading into their next era, the post-Tom Brady era, with an opportunity to dominate the division. Because while I think the New York Jets found a good quarterback in Sam Darnold, I don't think the Bills did. But you can definitely say that they, at the very least, have their long-term plan at that position. And I think Stephen Ross is annoyed, particularly with those two teams going out and doing it and maybe even looking like they went and found it, that the Dolphins have not tried that since Ryan Tannehill. So I really do think that based off some of the comments, it was weird to me reading the tweets in London. I haven't seen the press conference, but reading the tweets and some of the things that were coming out of Stephen Ross's mouth, that it seems like they're going to go for like a dramatic rebuild. And in that case, maybe you don't. First off, who would want the job? Who would want the job of being 3-13? What for example, Kyle Shanahan. He's one of the hot coaching candidates. Like if you look at his record now, his record's like 6-26 or something like that in 2 seasons because they traded for Garoppolo. He won some games, but in the end, with Nick Mullins and C.J. Beathard and all these guys, they haven't had any kind of success. That might ruin his reputation. I still think people think Kyle Shanahan is a good coach, but coaches and GMs don't want to have losing attached to their resume because, as we discussed earlier, it harms their ability to get other jobs.
Yeah, and look, I was surprised by it from Ross. It's almost like he found religion on this, after all of the 6 to 10 win seasons that they've had during his tenure. And look, I mean, we've been arguing for this for the Heat in certain ways, and they've been hamstrung, and it's not their philosophy to do it. There's nothing really stopping Ross from doing it. The only thing I will say is this. In the NBA, like there is like a definitive path to, breaking something completely down and starting over. We're seeing Atlanta do it now. Other franchises have done it. Like I said, we've wanted the Heat to do it. Philadelphia did it. I mean, there's a path. You go get that one guy. Like anybody who goes and gets Zion this year. Like Cleveland is trying to be as bad. I mean, part of it is they're trying to be as bad as they possibly can. I'm talking about the Cavs, not the Browns. That's another situation. But they're just bad at doing stuff in Cleveland with the Cavs, unless LeBron's there. And so they're just going to be awful, and they're going to get one of the Duke kids, and they're going to rebuild around that, and they'll probably get lucky in the lottery because they always do. And there's a path. In the NFL, it's a little bit more challenging. Like it is all about getting the quarterback. It's all about getting the quarterback. And we can talk about what the Browns have done and that they've stockpiled talent and picks and that maybe Sashi Brown was right. And then Dorsey has come in and done a really good job in terms of picking the players, which you knew he would because he had that reputation in Kansas City. But really it's about, the reason that people are excited about the Browns is because they have a quarterback finally. They got to the number 1 pick of the draft, and it looks like they took the right guy in Baker Mayfield.
To illustrate on our trip, that Sunday that I think that Manny Diaz got fired was the final week of the NFL season. We got back to London around, I want to say like 9:30ish from Manchester. And Mike Ryan, who's a big Browns fan that I was on the trip with, he said, no, I don't want to go anywhere. I want to go back to our apartment so we can watch the Red Zone channel and watch Baker Mayfield's last game. In a game that didn't matter for them. Like, the Browns fans are really freaking excited right now about their team, and they just had an under 500 season. But going from 0 wins to 7 to go from no quarterback to a quarterback means everything. It means absolutely everything.
Right, but you have to get to a certain point. Now, you mentioned Tua. The other part of this is it's not just Tua in 2020. Sure. It's also potentially Jake Fromm. There's a bunch
Justin
of guys.
Herbert, who's coming
Justin
back to Oregon.
Herbert. It's going to be a quarterback draft, I think, that is somewhat similar to what we saw last year, which is the year that we thought that the Dolphins should move up from 11 and take someone. So I guess the question on tanking is, in the NFL, there are not a ton of great examples. Like we talk about the Houston Astros in baseball, and that's become, the Cubs before then that they did that. But in the NFL, there's not a ton of examples. The Browns are sort of the first one, I think, that is the test case here for moving out of really bottoming out and then figuring out where to go from here. We've seen a lot of teams bottom out, like, say, the Detroit Lions, and then they popped right back from 0-16 to like a 6-9 win team for the next 7 years, right? So I don't know that there's a strategy to tanking the same way that there's a strategy to tanking in the NBA. This feels a little bit to me, and I don't blame Ross for it, but it feels a little bit to me like he's just thrown his hands up and said, I've tried everything else. I've tried everything else. Like
I've tried everything else. That's a short-term solution. We've got to find a new corner so our secondary can get better. We've got to find a new defensive end so we can get better pass rush. Things that are about next year and acquiring players for next year to try and win as many games as possible next year. I think this is the first time they've really taken a step back and said, you know what would be great for us 5 years from now to do this. And I do agree with you that it's hard, though, because in the NBA, the disparity between the top player in the league, let's just say LeBron James for argument's sake, and who the Cleveland Cavaliers are throwing out there is so disparate that you're almost guaranteed to lose. That, like, you have a pretty solid guarantee. Yeah, Atlanta, who's trying to tank, beat the Heat last night, but for the most part, you're going to lose more often than you win, and you're going to get into these lottery positions that you want to be in. Whereas, for me, the team that has most obviously, other than Cleveland, tried to tank in the last couple of years is Buffalo. And they ended up going 9-7 and making the playoffs when they had stripped their team for parts. And this year they just went 6-10 with their new quarterback. So in an era in which they've been trying to be bad, they've gone 15-17. Whereas you look at the teams that have been, as bad as you can say, Arizona this year. I don't think they were trying to be bad. They drafted their number one overall pick quarterback. I mean, maybe the Raiders were. I guess maybe the Raiders is a decent example of it working, and we'll see what they do with it. But man, I just don't see that obvious path to, unless you really go full-on destruction, like play rookies and undrafted free agents at every position, don't even hit the salary floor, like do everything that you can in order to have a bad team so that you're guaranteed to go to it, or play, like, I don't know, David Fales at quarterback for 16 games. Like, have a quarterback that is so bad that no matter, like, start Brock Osweiler for 16 games. And even then, he beat the Chicago Bears, best defense in the league, in overtime. So, like, I just don't see that obvious path to losing that there is in the NBA, because realistically winning in the NFL is in the margins. You just don't see, particularly this season, that many teams that were that bad where you knew going into a game. Like the Giants got on a run. Tampa, went into New Orleans and won this year. They're the best team in the league by some account. So like it's hard in this league to really say we're going 3-13 this year, no matter what, unless you're basically telling the coaches to throw the game, which no self-respecting coach or player is going to do.
Well, and you talk about teams that were trying to lose. I mean, both the Jets and the Bills have been trying to lose over the past couple of years, and the Dolphins' record is not much better than theirs. Like, so I think Ross looked at that and was like, what are we doing here? So I give him some credit for at least a semblance of a strategy. I just don't know exactly how they execute it, because you talk about trading, for parts, and, the Xavier Howard thing is something we're going to talk about, I'm sure, on future podcasts. But, they have some decent core young players that I don't think they want to introduce to losing every week. I mean, that's the other thing to think about. Like, do you want a Minkah Fitzpatrick going through a couple of 2-14 seasons? Like, it's not like they don't have any young talent on the roster. They drafted, Jerome Baker worked out. I don't know what Gesicki is going to be. I mean, he was used totally improperly this year, so it's hard to really evaluate. But they've drafted some decent players over the past couple of years, so the roster is not completely barren. So I'm curious to see what direction they go here. I do think if Greer is a short time, you always have to think about, what is the status of the person who's making the final decision, right? So if Greer is a short timer, potentially, is he going to be okay with a total teardown? Has Ross already told him that that's what he wants?
Right,
and that if the guy willing to do it, is that the possibility here?
And that if you're willing to pull this off for me, you're not going to get fired. Like, I'm not going to fire you. I might demote you and bring in someone else to be above you, but I'm definitely not going to fire you.
I want to introduce you to one of the great sponsors of the 5 Reasons Sports Network, and that is Brunt Insurance, where you can find all of your protection under one roof. They offer home, auto, commercial, and life insurance, and they're licensed to write insurance for the entire state of Florida. That's Pensacola all the way to the Keys. They've got multiple carriers for all the product lines. Ensure you're paying the lowest rate in your area. And I can speak to this personally because I sent Greg Brunt all of my insurance policies that I had with other companies. He came back to me, said, well, one of them you're doing okay, so just keep that one where it is. But I had one for a condo and I had one for my cars. And he said in both cases, I could be doing better. He saved me $700. Took one phone call, 15 minutes. I don't want to use 15 minutes because somebody else uses that. It took 14 minutes, and he got all of that stuff taken care of for me. So check out bruntinsurance.com. That's bruntinsurance.com. Greg's also a proud sponsor of the Homes for Heroes program. That means if you're a first responder, teacher, military, or healthcare professional, you'll get a special discount from bruntinsurance.com. Here's the phone number if you prefer to do that, 954-589-2222.
And today's episode of the 5 Reasons Podcast is brought to you by Doral Toyota, which is one of our great partners, and like us, is pure South Florida. That's Doral Toyota, where you can find all your favorite Toyota models. Whether you're looking for a new, used, or certified pre-owned vehicle, Doral Toyota is located at 9775 Northwest 12th Street, just a few blocks from International and Dolphin Malls. Experience the Doral difference, which means 4 years complimentary maintenance and roadside assistance on all new vehicles. In-house financing is available for credit-related issues. Also, if you mention 5 Reasons when you call 305-680-1129 or come in the dealership, you will work with a dedicated manager, not a salesman. Unlike other dealers, Doral Toyota prides itself on an honest and transparent buying process. That's Doral Toyota, DoralToyota.com, or stop in at 9775 Northwest 12th Street. Vamos, let's go, Doral Toyota.
So let's evaluate the coaches, because as we're taping this podcast, there's some news from NFL Network. One of the guys that we thought we were going to be discussing today was Bears defensive coordinator Vic Fangio, who has time now because the Bears lost yesterday. That was not Cody Parkey's fault, but anyway, whole separate story. But Vic Fangio is available for interviews. Apparently, he's a big-time candidate in Denver under John Elway. But according to NFL Network, he will not be interviewing with the Dolphins. And apparently, unless I'm reading this wrong, this was the Dolphins' choice. I don't think it's that Fangio declined the interview. And by the way, Fangio was the favorite of 2 of the 3 guys on our 3 yards per carry podcast. So that's an interesting one that he would decide, or that that they would decide that they don't want to interview him. I mean, I don't think anything that happened yesterday would have affected that. He was,
his defense was great.
Yeah, right. Here we go. This is Ian Rappaport. This is about 30 minutes ago as we're taping this on a Monday morning. Update on Bears defensive coordinator Vic Fangio. The Dolphins, who requested him and did research, ended up not scheduling an interview with Fangio. So it's just the Broncos for him. Miami, meanwhile, is still slated to interview special teams coach Darren Rizzi this week. Also, we do believe they're going to interview Mike Munchak, although I don't know when that one's been scheduled for. So the Fangio one, that was an interesting prospect to me, because what he sort of spelled out to me was competence, right? He's never been a head coach, but everywhere he's coached a defense, that defense has outperformed expectations. And, look, can I say that he looks like a football coach? I hate doing the eye test thing, but doesn't Vic Fangio look like, he's like central casting.
As the name of a football coach, too. I mean, that, his nose, his furrowed nose when he looks upset in a photograph is just as football coach as it gets.
Right. So I'm a little surprised, not because of that, but because of the competence and the defensive acumen, that he wouldn't have still been a consideration for the Dolphins.
Can I very quickly, before we move on from him, be annoyed at the fact that people were ageist about this idea? That he's 60 years old and he's never been a coach. If the Dolphins get 6 good years out of a head coach, you wouldn't throw a parade? Are you kidding me? Talking about age? It doesn't mean that he's this, troglodyte that's never, had an interesting offensive thought, or maybe he doesn't need to because he'll hire an offensive coordinator. But we can say in the modern era of defenses, he still knows how to coach defenses. Bruce Arians was 60 when he took over as interim coach of the Indianapolis Colts, and Bruce Arians is a hot commodity right now. Even understanding that he would be among the older candidates, you can't do a job at 60? I was so annoyed by this.
This reminds me of Coach L a little bit, and maybe this is maybe this is not the best time to bring this up, because it's been a tough season for the Canes basketball team. But when Larrañaga was hired, that was what I heard. Right? Why are you turning over the keys to the program to an older guy? And look, this came up with Rick too, and it played out a little bit. But I don't think it's about age. I think it's about passion for the game. And look, Jimmy Johnson, I don't even know how old he was his last year with the Dolphins, but he was done. He was done with football. We've seen young guys be done. And I understood the interest in Fangio, because if you're Steve Ross and you just dealt with what I consider sort of Adam Gase's, youthful hubris, right? He was never wrong about anything, right? He knew everything, even though I
always got the feeling that he thought he was better than the place.
Yes. Well, that was said, though, when he got the job initially. I forgot who tweeted this, but it was a credible reporter who said that at the time, Gase had basically said it was the best of the bad jobs that were out there when he took it. So he had this arrogance that to me was unearned. It was okay, Peyton Manning, declared that he was, a genius, and so there he is.
He got a good season out of Jay Cutler that time.
Right, right. Like Jay wasn't smoking cigarettes the whole year. Like that, like this is considered to be a positive. I wouldn't have had a problem with a competent person, somebody who could organize a team and put them in the right place. And basically you knew, and I've also seen Fangio in press conferences and others, he carries himself in a professional way. I would have been fine with that. I'd be curious to find out, and it will come out, why the Dolphins backed away from that one, unless they think he's getting the Denver job anyway, which is possible, or unless they've settled on somebody, which is also possible. And so let's get to the guys they've interviewed or they're going to interview. We'll get to Rizzi in a minute because there was a lot of interesting stuff that came out from the players about him. They interviewed Brian Flores, defensive coordinator for the Patriots. Now, the first warning sign on this is there has not been a Bill Belichick disciple who's had success as a head coach in the NFL. Not one. For all of the interest in Josh McDaniels, he was basically a failure in Denver. I mean,
and a quick one, too.
A quick one.
You talk about youthful hubris. My word.
Well, right. To me, Gase is McDaniel's light. Like that's what we got down here. Now, look, Gase may rehabilitate his image in the same way that McDaniel's has now. Okay, of course, Gase may rehabilitate it by going to Aaron Rodgers or Baker Mayfield, just like McDaniel's rehabilitated it by going to Tom Brady. But look, McDaniel's has not worked out. And by the way, Indianapolis did better with the coach that they ended up with, which was like their fifth choice, which was Frank Reich, who's going to get some Coach of the Year mentioned this year and still has the Colts in the playoffs. So McDaniels didn't work out. Romeo Crennel has been a really good defensive coordinator, is still a really good defensive coordinator, did not work out as a head coach. Charlie Weiss did not work out as a head coach at all after coaching under Belichick. So none of these guys have had success. And there's not one, right? I mean,
Patricia's season this year was a disaster.
Dean Pease never got a head coaching job. He was talked about for a lot of them.
I would say Vrabel had a decent year this year. With Tennessee, but again, that's one season. Like you can't. But
Vrabel also is a little bit of a different deal. Vrabel was Vrabel a coordinator? No, he was.
No, he was.
I
think it was. Well, he played under Belichick. He might have been a linebackers coach before getting the same job with Bill O'Brien. But yeah, he coached more under Bill O'Brien than he did under Bill Belichick. That's for sure.
All right, does Bill O'Brien qualify as a successful? I mean.
I would say like somewhere in between a success and a failure, like an okay. He's done an okay job. He takes the Texans to the playoffs a lot, but they've kind of been the most talented team in the division. And when they get into a big playoff game, it doesn't seem like now. It does also seem like they're never healthy. But this past weekend they were pretty healthy, and they couldn't muster up much of anything against Indianapolis. But I would say like he's done an okay job. I wouldn't say he should be fired. I wouldn't say he's been a smashing success, but O'Brien's been okay.
And compare that to the Andy Reid tree, right? Where we're watching Matt Nagy yesterday, and we're gonna get into Bieniemy here. But the Andy Reid tree has borne a lot more fruit. I mean, Doug Peterson's part of that too.
Yeah.
And so those coaches have had a lot more success. I wonder if it has anything to do with the head coach's style in terms of what he delegates and what he doesn't, because that may play into it. I don't know the specifics on that, but. Cycling it back to Brian Flores, what we know about Brian Flores is that he's been part of every part of the Patriots organization. So this is someone who has been on the scouting personnel side as well as the coaching side. I do think that's an advantage. I think that's a positive that you sort of know how that stuff works, because a lot of coaches don't, and then they overrule everything and they don't understand why the personnel side is doing something when it may actually have a cap implication or an implication 2 or 3 years from now that the coach is not thinking about, because the coach, it's Tuesday and the coach is thinking about Sunday and that's it and no further. So I do think that Flores having kind of this varied background in that organization is valuable. As far as the Patriots defense itself, what I'll say about that is, they've run through a lot of players over the past few years. Like we always think of the Patriots as this static organization, where they're the least static organization, right? Because they ship guys out a year early, right? And you'll have a guy who has 12 sacks and all of a sudden he's playing for Arizona, or you have a guy like Collins and he's your best linebacker and then he's in Cleveland the next week. So Flores has had to cycle through a lot of different players. They've brought in some free agents in recent years who haven't worked out all that well. The defense has been good, not great. Does this candidate get you excited?
No, it doesn't. And actually, as we tape this, there's been an odd amount of news. I don't feel like we've ever had, on the subject we're talking about, more news than we've had. But Chris Kaufman of our 3 yards per carry account has basically secured in some way the way that all of the interviews have gone for the Dolphins coaching candidates. And he actually noted about Brian Flores that, quote, "It did not go poorly. It just did not blow the Dolphins away," which for me is how I feel about most of the candidates. Like first-year coordinators and Bieniemy and in Flores, Dennis Allen, a guy who failed in Oakland and has rehabilitated well in New Orleans, and give him credit for doing so. But again, someone who has failed previously, and Chris Richard, the Cowboys defensive coordinator, who we don't even know what his job title is. So in general, I've not been blown away by the candidates, and I feel the same way about Brian Flores. And I don't want to be harsh to him. I don't know anything about him. And the Patriots defense, and frankly the Patriots team, it's been a weird season for them because the whole year they felt short on talent, and yet they get a first-round bye again. It doesn't make any sense. So obviously Belichick has that way of making all that work, but you can never really separate the credit from the head coach and the defensive coordinator. While Matt Patricia has been a seismic failure in Detroit so far and has angered a lot of people there, and unsurprisingly is a bit too arrogant. There has also been a lot of talk about how Matt Patricia has kind of laid out the groundwork for how to slow down the Los Angeles Rams, for how his team played the Rams. So we don't know, Brian Flores, someone who's been a lifer in that building, how much he has taken on board from Bill Belichick. And ultimately, that is the question about these Patriots disciples, is that how much do you really get let behind the curtain by Belichick? Who does Belichick trust enough to say, all right, if I give all this guy my secrets, then am I potentially, harming myself and reducing my value? You don't know who he's let in, and you don't know if Brian Flores is one of these guys.
Tuesday, January 15th, Miami Heat Beat is hosting another watch party poolside at Duffy's in North Miami. Come out and watch with us as the Miami Heat take on the Milwaukee Bucks at 8 p.m. There's going to be games, drink specials, and you'll even have a chance to win Heat Beat's newly released Justice Better t-shirt. Plus, someday, you'll be able to tell your grandkids that you were there when 5 Reasons finally broke their watch party curse. Okay, fine. I'm not making any promises, but we're 0-8 right now, and this fucking losing streak's gotta end at some point, right? So come on down and hang out with some of your favorite Heat Beat personalities, as well as other members of 5 Reasons Sports. That's Tuesday, January 15th. Poolside at Duffy's, 3969 Northeast 163rd Street, North Miami Beach. Tip-off is at 8 p.m.
I always compare this to the Heat, right? The Heat never let anybody out of the organization because they're always worried about the secrets getting out. And so you never see anybody leave there. And with the Patriots, they have certain secrets that they probably don't want getting out.
Right.
Was Flores in the video department? There's a lot of stuff with the Patriots that's different than other organizations. All right. So as you mentioned, Chris Kaufman tweeted out as we're speaking here about Eric Bieniemy. So let's get to him next. As for chief offensive coordinator Eric Bieniemy, I'm told the interview went well, that he had good ideas, that he liked Miami's roster, and is interested in the job. Now, I mentioned the Andy Reid tree. This is part of the Andy Reid tree. You probably don't remember Eric Bieniemy as a player. He was a really good player. In fact, I was thinking about this. He would easily be the best player to ever coach the Dolphins, right? There's no question, right?
Yeah.
Dave Wannstedt was an offensive lineman. Don Shula was not known as a great player. Jimmy Johnson, also not known as a great player. Did Philbin play anything? I can't imagine it, right?
It would seem improbable, although we did learn last week that Manny Diaz played left tackle in high school, so I won't be surprised by much of anything anymore.
Dan Campbell was a player. He was so Dan Campbell would be, I guess, the best player to ever coach. Well, Todd Bowles was a pretty good player too, right? So yeah, you have those two, but Bieniemy was a special player, particularly in college at Colorado. He's been around a long time. He's coached running backs primarily. Andy Reid doesn't screw around with the people he puts in charge of his offense, right? He has to trust you. Now, I think one of the questions that would come up here with Bieniemy is a similar question that came up with Philbin, which is that, he was basically running somebody else's offense, right? Like it is the Andy Reid offense. Okay, there's no question about that. Whether he calls every play or doesn't call every play, and I know Andy's gone in and out of that over the years, it's his deal, and you have to learn his offense and then structure it to the players you have. To me, the most attractive thing about Bieniemy, though, is I mean, it's very simple. Just watch Pat Mahomes, right? Because when Mahomes came out of college, and I know you loved him, all right, and I know CK loved him. There's tweets going back like 3-4 years on him, but there were questions about how raw he was, that everything physical was there, okay, and that his mind was there. He was certainly smart enough, but it was just he was raw in terms of the way that he approached the position. And I'll tell you, he does not look raw this year. And somebody's working with him, okay, to make that happen. And the thing that's been most impressive to me about Mahomes is he doesn't seem to make the same mistake twice.
Yep.
And so if you're a team that's really looking to develop a quarterback, if that's what you're about, then why would you not seriously consider, and I'm glad that the Dolphins are, why would you not seriously consider a guy who's been working with the player who looks like the one with the most potential in the league right now, and just put up 50 touchdown passes. So to me, that's what's attractive about Eric Bieniemy.
Well, again, the issue is credit, right? Because we don't know, as a first-year offensive coordinator who's not calling the plays, what Bieniemy's role is in working with Patrick Mahomes. Now, we can say, and the 3 yards per carry guys have said that he allows the Chiefs to play with a lot more freedom than Matt Nagy did, and you can certainly see that based off the fact that Patrick Mahomes has thrown passes no look and with his left hand this year. So there's a whole lot of freedom in this Chiefs offense, but I still think that it's a very inexperienced candidate. Now, he's obviously getting a lot of interviews for a reason, and I would certainly understand if you want to get the guy standing next to Andy Reid, but it does show a little bit of a lack of vision, in my view, to basically, it is sort of hiring the guy standing next to Belichick. We don't really know, obviously the Dolphins would learn in an interview, but we don't really know what his role in developing Patrick Mahomes was. As the offensive coordinator underneath Andy Reid, you will get some credit, but again, I don't know what that amount of credit is. I would trust the Dolphins to find out. I would trust the Dolphins to vet him well in a coaching process, but just sort of on the surface, again, I can go either way on it, right? Because the Chiefs offense has been the most dynamic offense in the league, and if you're sort of finding an aspirational figure to who you want it to be, then you would certainly go for the Chiefs offense. But they've also tried this before with Cam Cameron, who had an aspirational offense with the San Diego Chargers in 2006. You tried it with Adam Gase, who had an aspirational offense with Peyton Manning and quarterback. So even understanding that in theory this is what you want it to be, we don't know how directly responsible Eric Bieniemy is for making those things happen.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I mean that's the issue. But that's the issue with most coordinators on good teams, sure. Right? And it's very hard to sort of separate one from the other.
But at the same time, like Sean McVay, who was an offensive coordinator for a play calling head coach, and he is the preeminent genius in the NFL. So we just don't know, and we really don't find out until they get into the position. And
Bieniemy may not call the plays here too, because sure. If I'm Steve Ross, that's not something I want anymore, right? We just tried that, and Adam Gase was designing plays on the sideline while his defense was on the field. So I mean, he may talk to Bieniemy and say, okay, who can you bring in that you trust to call the plays for you? You design the offense, but I want you coaching the entire team. Again, these are issues to consider. I just think there is a track record with Reid coaches where, for whatever reason, they come out prepared. And Belichick coaches, for whatever reason, don't. And I do think there's something to that, because I'm going to go to the NBA again. Greg Popovich coaches have done very well in the NBA typically, yep. Right? I mean, Budenholzer, Borrego, had the opportunity in Orlando, but his coaches, Brett Brown, right, seems to be doing well. Jimmy Butler might disagree, but it seems to be doing well in Philadelphia. So he's had some success getting his coaches out there in the space. And even the GMs that come out of San Antonio have done well. I mean, look what Sean Marks is doing, up in Brooklyn, under R.C. Buford. It seems like those guys come out of there and they perform well. So there's certain organizations they do and certain they don't. And really not much has come out of New England that's been positive, whereas a lot has come out of Andy Reid organizations. So the only thing with Bieniemy is there's clearly competition for Bieniemy too. Sure. And the Dolphins might like him, and but they may have a feeling that he likes other situations better. I thought it was interesting. Boomer Esiason, who I know is not liked by Dolphin fans, so I knew my tweet would get this response, but Boomer was basically ranking the 8 open jobs. He had the Dolphins in a 4-way tie for 5th.
Yeah.
And he actually said it was one of the 5 worst jobs in the league, which, again, I come back to this, okay? Great weather, no taxes, tradition of organization, owner spends. I mean, if there is a perception of the Dolphins as a bad job, that's on the culture of the organization,
right.
because
and their lack of success, right? Like, right. if we're saying that the Dolphins can kind of be a graveyard for NFL coaches, then I think a lot of people would be aware. Like, and it's not like Chris Greer has a track record where you're saying, I'm going to go work for that guy because I know he's going to get me to success. Like, I kind of get it. No quarterback, a roster that's in flux, a team that's won the division once in 17 years. Like, you can kind of understand why NFL head coaches are afraid. All right, I've kind of worked to build my status as a guy who can be getting a lot of head coaching jobs or a lot of head coaching offers. Am I really going to spoil it on this one organization? Because I do think that Adam Gase probably feels that way right now. As much as he might get another job, he might not. And he might have taken a pretty significant career detour by virtue of the fact that he took this Dolphins job when maybe his better inclination should have been to just stay in Chicago and wait for a good job. So, like, I don't think the Dolphins have a good candidacy right now because the owner has kind of just come out and said he wants to rebuild. You don't have your quarterback on your roster. As a matter of fact, there's been plenty of reports that Tannehill is not coming back either to be traded or released. So what is attractive right now from a football point of view? All the other things you mentioned, I don't get, frankly, why the Dolphins have such an unattractive position. But from a football point of view, it most certainly is unattractive because even the Browns job, the Browns have been a laughingstock in the league for 15 years. At the very least, they have a quarterback right now. They have a future. The
Right.
Dolphins don't appear to have one right now.
Hey everybody, Seth Levitt and OJ McDuffie of the Fish Tank here, but we're not diving in with a great story right now. Instead, we want to tell you about an incredibly fun upcoming charity event benefiting the Jason Taylor Foundation.
That's right, Big Seth. Wiffle Blast. Man, I can't wait.
I know you're fired up, Juice. The 3rd annual Wiffle Blast presented by Funky Buddha Brewery and Sports Chiropractic and Natural Health Solutions will take place on Saturday, January 19th at Pine Trails Park in Parkland.
Man, you guys do a great job with this event. I played last year with my son and a couple of friends, and we really had a blast. From the competition to the home run derby to the kids zone, it was just a perfect day from start to finish. Do I still have time to get my team in?
Yeah, we got you, Juice. We still have room for a few more teams as well. And since the 5 Reasons Sports Network is a media partner for the event, the foundation is offering $100 off the cost of a team if you use the code.
They have a team?
Yeah, they have a team. Ethan and those guys. I mean, there's some studs on that
I can't
roster.
wait to play them.
We'll put you guys in the same division.
All right, that's what's up.
So we're going to put 5 Reasons and Juice in the same division. And if you sign up now, you can be in that division as well and get $100 off the cost of a team if you use the code 5 Reasons. That's the number 5 Reasons. And the best part of it all, OJ, is that your donation will help support children battling cancer as well as pediatric emergencies.
Yeah, that's what matters most.
Absolutely it is. For more information, visit jasontaylorfoundation.org or call 954-424-0799. Ethan, get that arm warmed up.
No, they don't. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if Bieniemy chooses one of these other jobs. It doesn't seem like Cleveland's in the cards for him. It does seem like the Jets are a legitimate possibility for him. I think both of those are better jobs than the Dolphins right now. I don't know that the Cincinnati job is better. You've got 15 years of entrenched culture with Marvin Lewis. Andy Dalton's not really any more the answer than Ryan Tannehill is. They've had talent on the roster that they've wasted in recent years. I don't know what kind of position they're in. But so there are other teams that need coaches because they're in bad shape too. I mean, one of the reasons you need a coach. I mean, we everybody's like, well, Adam Gase, look how other teams love Adam Gase. See, the Dolphins made a mistake. Like I was getting that tweet and I'm like, yeah, well, all those teams also need coaches right now, right? Why do they need coaches? Because they haven't been successful. So maybe they're not so good at picking coaches. Like sometimes that plays into it too. Let's get to a couple of the other candidates. I think the one that got Dolphin fans excited over the past couple of days was Chris Richard. And I think that's some of that is because there's some viral video of him that I think reflects well on his ability to lead. But also, I think it's because he took a group that was not really known as a great defense over the past couple of years, and really that's a unit that's been carrying that team in the playoffs. Also, according to CK, and I heard this from some other people too, that interview went very well. The Dolphins, went to Dallas to watch his work. Steve Ross was there. They conducted the interview. Apparently that went over extremely well. What's your thoughts on, I don't know, I guess I'll say I don't know a lot about him other than Richard Sherman being a huge believer and there being some other players who've endorsed him, which is always, positive if players feel your head coaching material. What's your feeling on him?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. He's been around Pete Carroll his whole career. Started as a grad assistant at USC and then went with him to Seattle and was there for 7 years. And yet at the end of it, he's, as CK pointed out a bunch on their podcast, was the only defensive coordinator that he's fired. And because Dan Quinn took a head coaching job in Atlanta, it's the only defensive coordinator that he's fired. So from that perspective, you wonder why. But I do kind of see from sort of the optics point of view why it makes sense to bring him in because of the sort of fiery personality on the sideline, of what he's doing this year with Dallas as their defensive backs coach and sort of de facto defensive coordinator again. Don't know the deal there, but it does sort of seem like he's an attractive candidate. The Dolphins appear to have gone all in. Jerry Jones had mentioned that he was at the game, that the Dolphins, were at the game, and it seems like the one they burned the most calories on. CK is saying it's the most impressive one, and so it does feel like right now, if you were to make a betting favorite, he would be the favorite to be the Dolphins' next coach. Again, someone who came through the Seahawks organization and has drawn the plaudits, as you mentioned, of Richard Sherman, and I do kind of find interesting, we'll get to it when we get to Rizzi, the idea of player endorsements and how much you factor that in, but I think he's someone, another young guy, so you do have that potential, he's 39, he'd be among the younger coaches, and we just went through that with Gase, and you wonder how much that affects the mentality, but from all the boxes that you would tick, I would say he's probably a pretty attractive candidate.
Yeah, there's a lot I've heard about him that I like, and I do think player endorsements matter to a degree. I think you have to distinguish, and you're right, this is really a Rizzi topic, but you have to distinguish between players who like a guy because he's easy on them or players who like a guy because they respect him. And the comments about Chris Richards seem to be that there's respect there. Also, there's certain endorsements I take more seriously. Richard Sherman's one of the smartest guys in the NFL. Not only is he one of the best players, but he's a highly intelligent person, right? And if he related well to Chris Richard, to me, that speaks very well of Chris Richard, that Richard Sherman, because this is one of the things I learned from covering a lot of Heat teams that had a lot of smart guys. If they're being fed bullshit, smart guys in a locker room will read right through it, and that corrupts your locker room immediately. So if Richard Sherman felt this guy was a straight shooter that he could communicate on his level, that's a very good thing. And so definitely, I think that, that's, to me, it's an intriguing candidate. I don't really care if they bring in an offensive or defensive guy at this point.
Right, because they're bad at both, so what difference does it make?
What difference does it make? And what we've also seen is they've brought in offensive or defensive coaches before, right? And with Jimmy Johnson and Dave Wanstead, and yes, the defenses were better than the offenses, but I don't think that's the reason for it. They brought in offensive coaches like Joe Philbin and Cam Cameron and Tony Sperano. They didn't have great offenses. So I don't know that it matters one way or the other. So I'm fine with them bringing in offense or defense.
I will say, though, right now the only coach with a defensive pedigree that's left in the playoffs is Bill Belichick. Because you look at Andy Reid, obviously, is all about offense. Anthony Lynn came from an offensive assistant background. You have Frank Reich in charge of the Colts. You have Sean Payton in charge of the Saints, Sean McVay in charge of the Rams, Doug Peterson in charge of the Eagles, and Jason Garrett in charge of the Cowboys. Belichick's the only one with an out-and-out defensive background in that lot. So it does seem, in the era of scoring, in the era of coach play callers, that it does seem like right now the trend is towards getting guys in who are offensive guys. So I do kind of understand it from that perspective, but I think at the moment where the Dolphins are right now, kind of starting from scratch, I don't think it particularly matters.
No, I don't think it does. But there's another option. You get a special teams coach. And so we're going to finish the podcast by talking about two of them, one of whom who's established but would probably cost the Dolphins something, and the other who's right in-house. You mentioned the comments from players about Darren Rizzi. I'm not surprised by this. I think you and I have been talking about Darren Rizzi for weeks. I actually said that they should fire Gase and make Rizzi the head coach a few weeks ago. So this is not a surprise to me that there's respect for him. His unit has been by far the best on the team for the past few years. I mean, even yesterday, I think proved him out a little bit, although Cody Parkey did make 3 field goals. Darren Rizzi was okay with moving on from Cody Parkey and finding a new kicker, and that kicker probably should have made the Pro Bowl in Jason Sanders. Like, his units have been prepared. His players have played hard for him and played well. I've made the case for special teams coaches before because one of the things special teams coaches have to do is know the whole roster, because anybody on the team, except for the quarterbacks, could be on one of their units at one point or another. In fact, the quarterbacks are as holders, the backup quarterbacks a lot of times. And they also need to learn how to coach not just 40 through 53 on the roster, but really 40 through 60. Anybody that's brought in, they have to coach up that guy during the year, and they can't pull in Adam Gase and saying, oh, we don't have our players healthy. They have to coach whoever they're given. So I am a believer in special teams coaches as head coaches, even though there have been very few of them. So I don't have an issue with Darren Rizzi, head coach, as special teams coach. I also don't have an issue with them giving the head coaching job to somebody that the players want. If they're going to play hard for him, particularly at a time where you're rebuilding, right, where you just want to be competitive, but maybe you're not trying to win a Super Bowl, don't have an issue with that either. And the thing about the Darren Rizzi thing, a couple things. One is it was current players, right? So several current players. But I found it interesting which former players spoke up. Chris, not just Reggie Bush from out of nowhere, right? And others, Mike Pouncey, who were not on the team anymore. And I think some of this speaks to sort of a dislike of Gase also. It was kind of like, okay, this guy should have been the head coach all along if you'd listen to the players. But the fact that Jason Taylor jumped in, now,
to me, Jarvis Landry was an interesting one too, because he's someone that has like almost zero positive feelings for the Dolphins anymore, and that he still tweeted about this. Like, it's kind of crazy to me.
It is. And here's the thing with JT. And again, total disclosure here. Obviously, I have a relationship with JT that goes back a long way, having covered him. Seth Levitt, who's in our network, hosts our Fish Tank podcast, runs Jason Taylor's foundation. Okay. So we're actually competing in the Jason Taylor Wiffle Bowl tournament in a week.
Which you've heard about in this podcast.
Which you did. So, there's a little bit of background here with Jason. And all I can say is Jason Taylor does not jump out there on this stuff often. He just doesn't. Okay. He doesn't. It's a little bit like OJ, who's gotten a little bit more public. OJ McDuffie, also a member of our network this year. But OJ doesn't really like to criticize the team. Jason still works with the team to a certain degree, doesn't like to criticize the team, doesn't like to sort of take opinions publicly on the team. It's just not his style. Okay. It's not the way he's gone about things. And for him to come out with a full-throated endorsement of Darren Rizzi during a coaching search, that tells you two things. One, Jason Taylor really respects Darren Rizzi a lot to do that. And two, I don't think, and I'm not going to speak for Jason here. I haven't spoken to Jason directly. I haven't even spoken to Seth about this. But I don't think that Jason would have done that if there wasn't some belief inside the organization that Rizzi could be the guy. I just don't think Jason would put himself out there like that. I don't think he put the organization out there like that, because there was a little bit of pressure there, right? It didn't. The tweet wasn't meant to apply pressure, but it's Jason freaking Taylor, okay?
Yeah, right.
And so other than Dan Marino, I mean, and then if Zach, right, and that's something else I want to talk about. But I mean, those are really the only three people that you want to hear from on Dolphin stuff, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And their opinion, carries a ton of weight, and like you said, it requires some effort. Now, obviously, punching up a tweet doesn't really take that much effort, but it is a lot of people going out of their way to endorse this candidacy. And the fact that, as you said, it is former players, not just current ones. Current ones I'm a little bit dubious about, and also I'm dubious about Rizzi as well, almost wondering if he's soliciting this, like, hey, this is my chance, like, I'm going to cash in all my goodwill and ask these guys to tweet stuff for me. Like, I don't know if that's what's happened here, or if this has just been a natural improvised outpouring of dozens of Dolphins players saying that they want Darren Rizzi as their coach. But the former players to me thing is fascinating, because they really don't have a ton of skin in the game. Like, I don't think Jason Taylor has really ever gotten bothered, other than when he was playing, about who the Dolphins coach is, and the fact that he has decided to, not burn some of his capital, but use some of his capital that he's built up with the fan base and the organization to give this man support. And I've always been behind the idea. I like the idea of special teams coach as head coach. I think we saw yesterday in the Bears game how sometimes coaches that have tunnel vision about what they do, in the case of Matt Nagy calling plays on offense, like he didn't manage the end of the game well. Like, I don't think those guys have really given that much time to managing the game, just as I don't think Adam Gase did. And so he handed that responsibility to Darren Rizzi. Darren Rizzi was in charge of timeouts and challenges, and I just think the head coaching position might be a tad overvalued in that I do think it is about managing the operation than it is about necessarily that coach directly affecting the outcomes with his play calling, with the scheme, and that comes down to coordinators. Now, there are a couple of current examples: Andy Reid, Sean McVay, Sean Payton, and look, those are the coaches of the best teams that are sort of evidence to the contrary. But I don't think Bill Belichick is strictly focused on defense, is strictly focused on what his area of expertise is. He's interested in everything, and I think special teams coaches are far more likely to do that than these kind of very obsessed with their own work offensive coordinators that have been, spending their whole lives drawing up plays and figuring out plays, that they do kind of lose sight of the rest of the game in a way that I don't think a special teams coach does.
No, and that's the next guy we want to get to here, because Rizzi is the safe choice, right? I mean, he's the safe choice in this sense. If it doesn't work, you go 3-13 and you draft one of those quarterbacks, and you try to retain Rizzi on the staff, and you bring in somebody else to coach one of those quarterbacks. And Darren Rizzi, I think, would welcome the opportunity of 1 year, right? Like to have that 1 year to prove he can be a head coach, and maybe it leads to something else later on. If it does work, you have your guy. And I think you're right about it coming down to the coordinators. Like, that's been one of the questions that's been asked, is what kind of a staff could Rizzi put together? He's been in this organization for so long, right? And so who does he know outside that he could bring in who could run the offense and the defense for him, so he can concentrate on sort of running the practices, learning game management, and all of those kinds of things. Like, I'm pretty sure he could hire a pretty damn good special teams coach, right? Like, because those guys all know each other. That's in his area. He probably knows who the best assistant special teams coach in the NFL is, and he'll get that guy. I'm not concerned about that. But offensive and defensive coordinators, who could he bring in? Now, the other option, we save this for last, is John Harbaugh. And there are a lot of reports out there, not surprisingly, that Steve Ross really wants John Harbaugh. And we saw John Harbaugh yesterday, stayed with Lamar Jackson, which I thought was the right decision. Okay. Lamar Jackson's your quarterback going forward. And I don't know that Joe Flacco makes some of those plays in the fourth quarter that Lamar Jackson makes. So I was fine with them sticking with Lamar Jackson. I'm not out on Lamar Jackson because of 3 horrible quarters in a playoff game. He's not the first. He won't be the last rookie quarterback to struggle in a playoff game. I still like his future. But it doesn't appear that things are good for Harbaugh in Baltimore right now. So, simple question before we close here. If you were asked to give up a first-round pick for John Harbaugh, your number 13 overall pick, or even, say, a 2020 first-round pick, do you do it?
No. I mean, I just like – I get it if you're trading picks for Belichick or for Andy Reid or for McVay, like the very top, the echelon of coaches where that their coaching has direct impact on winning, and that they've got a pretty figured out program of how they go and win games, and have done it in multiple places. I don't think Harbaugh is of that caliber. Like, I do understand like the greater idea, if you believe in coaching a lot and you think that the coaching matters to such a degree that winning in the margins, that coaching can sort of put you over the top. Like, I'm not generally opposed to the idea of using assets if you sort of value it that much, but I just don't value this guy that much. Like, I don't think John Harbaugh has this unique particular skill set that I'm giving up important assets. Okay, if a six round pick, that's one thing, but first round picks that you need, and like if you're saying giving up a first round pick next year to go and do it when we're saying that we want to use a first round pick to take a quarterback, like, no, you can't do that. Like, what if what if you go 4-12 and in order to go from 4-1 you need that first round pick? Like, you can't do that. And so I just, in this particular situation, where every pick that the Dolphins can use to rebuild their roster and fix their team, I am not for any use of assets to acquire a coach, unless that coach, you're saying, guarantees you success to the degree that a Belichick, a Reid, a McVay does.
Yeah, no, I'm with you to a degree. When I had Alfredo on from 3 Yards Per Carry, we first discussed this. I think both of us were okay with it for only this reason: we don't really trust Steve Ross to find a new coach. I think everything we're talking about all these other coaches, like, we're relying on Steve Ross and Chris Greer to decide which of these guys we're talking about. And we should have talked about Dennis Allen too, because he's kind of under the radar. They did speak to him also. He did not have a great tenure with Oakland, but apparently that's someone that had an okay interview with them. But I guess the biggest problem I have with some of these other inexperienced coaches is I don't know how good they'll be, and I don't know if Ross is capable of figuring that out. I mean, he clearly, I mean, look, Gase, I could give him a mulligan for Gase because there were a lot of people out there who bought into the Gase hype. And so I understand why Gase was a hot candidate at the time. I think there are some personality traits that probably were attractive to Ross that became less attractive over time. I think Gase's stubbornness and arrogance and all of that probably was attractive to Ross at first because he's like, yeah, we need someone to, fuck with things around here and change the culture and all that. And so he probably liked that. And then over time, he realized, well, no, it was really about Gase protecting his own work, right? Like, never taking responsibility for his own work, blaming it on other people. But I think at first I understood it. The Philbin hire, I never understood. There's nothing about Joe Philbin, okay, that screams head coach to me. There's just not. Like, he's a milquetoast personality. He wasn't designing the plays anyway in Green Bay. Like, that choice never made any sense to me. Like, every other choice the Dolphins have made over the years, like Nick Saban made sense, right? Even Dave Wannstedt, like, he was a disciple of Jimmy Johnson. He was the natural next guy. He didn't have success with Chicago with the Bears, and I know Bears fans didn't like him, but he was a hot coordinator when he went to the Bears. He was coming out of Dallas, all the rest. I understood that one. Okay, even Cam Cameron understood that one, right? Like, as you mentioned, Cam was running a great offense in San Diego. In 2008, Sperano. Okay, we trust Parcells, right? Whatever Parcells thinks this is the guy, this is the guy. All of those made sense to me. The Philbin one never made any sense. And so, to me, the guy who picked Joe Philbin as a first-time head coach, it's hard to trust him to pick the next guy. And so that's why I'm like, all right, give up the first-round pick. I've seen John Harbaugh coach. I know what he is. His teams make the playoffs. They get better later in the season. They constantly filter through defensive players. They still produce a top 10 defense. I know what that is. Like, and so that's a known quantity, and that's why I was okay with it. But now I'm thinking more along your lines. If you're going to go get a former special teams coach, just promote Rizzi. If the players want him, just promote Rizzi. If it doesn't work in a year, you're looking for a coach anyway. There'll be a new batch of coordinators. You go pick somebody else, maybe to coach your quarterback. You'll be a more attractive job because you'll be in line to draft a top quarterback. We know how that works. So I'm kind of out on the Harbaugh thing, even though I don't trust Ross to pick the next guy. Who do you think it's going to be? As we're taping this at 11:15. On a Monday, 3 yards per carry just tweeted out that Chris Richard, in their opinion, is the leader in the clubhouse right now. Is that who you think it's going to be?
Yeah, I think it'll be Chris Richard. I think he's probably the candidate who's most impressed them through the process, who kind of has all these ideas that I think make sense. There's been some reporting this morning that Darren Rizzi's interview is going to be delayed, and that for me is kind of an omen that either they're taking their time or they're trying to work out a contract in the next couple of days, and if it doesn't work out, then they'll get to Rizzi. So I think just, for me, the sign that they flew to Dallas and wanted to watch him coach, for me, was the sign that they're really intrigued by this candidate and that they're sort of going to really give him every opportunity to win this job. So I think what also the Cowboys defense did this weekend will give him a fair amount of credit as well. So I think it'll end up being Chris Richard.
And the other reason I think it's going to be him is because I do think the Cowboys are going to lose this weekend. And so I think look, you never want to make a decision based on 1 week or 2 weeks, but one of the concerns with Bieniemy is that you'll be waiting until potentially after the Super Bowl, right? And so a lot of owners don't like that, right? I mean, that you're losing 3 weeks to get started on your free agent plan, on evaluating the current roster, on all of those things. And we've seen that hurt head coaches, top coordinators in the past. There's been a lot of top coordinators who have not gotten the premium head coaching jobs because they were coaching up and through the Super Bowl. And I think that does make it a little more challenging. I mean, again, Dallas should lose this week. I'm not saying they will, but they should. I think they're 7-point dogs. And that would make Chris Richard available right away in the same way that Fangio was available this week. So I think you and I agree on this. But with the Dolphins, you just never know. Check out 3 yards per carry this week, obviously, for the latest on this. We're going to be doing another probably Dolphins-related episode. We're going to have Alex Dono. He just got a new show on 560. He's going to be joining us this week. And we're going to go back to Heat on Wednesday, Thursday this week. We're going to talk to Tommy Tighe, one of our favorites. You hear him on the pregame show on Heat Pregame and all that good stuff.
Looking forward to the puns. Get the puns in.
Well, you know what I want to do with that one. I want to bring Nikias on that pod, and I want to have a pun off between Nikias and Tommy Tig. I want to see who wins that one. So check out the other podcasts in our network, and we'll have more news on our website in the next few days.
Thank you for listening to the Fire Reason podcast. Thank you so much.